Hi everyone, thanks for taking the time. I'm Magnus, founder of CEEZER, and we basically help large corporations to build resilient portfolios of beyond supply chain mitigation measures. That might be carbon credits, could be carbon removal, and can also be increasingly insetting. And I think one of the things that probably most people have figured out by now is that carbon credits can be pretty complex. We look at an increasing landscape of different types. They all come with very specific risks, and quite honestly also very specific price points, right? On CEEZER currently we have credits tradable between $4.50 and $1,200 per ton. So it's almost impossible to think about like a benchmark price, right? The average won't really help you. And what you ultimately have to do if you want to build a successful and resilient portfolio of carbon credits is you need to understand what you should be paying more for, understand how you can kind of mix and match and build a resilient and risk-adjusted profile that allows you to kind of stay within your price mark, but also that minimizes the risk that you have on quality and supply. And I think we're usually looking at like around 4 types of risks when we work with our customers. The first being, quite frankly, the quality risk, depending on the data that you read, and I think we've all read the Guardian coverage lately. There's still a huge challenge with the integrity of carbon credits. And it's true for every carbon credit, right? I think our position was always to say, listen, when you engage in this category, which you should, there's no way for you to get to zero. So you should ultimately look at it a bit like you would look into investing into stock, right? There's not a return that you can safeguard, but you will always have a certain choice of having the impact that you want to have. The risk that's now coming in is really the volume risk. So as companies are moving towards net zero, they need to actually transition their carbon credit portfolios from traditional avoidance credits to permanent removal credits. If you look at the supply right now, I think we're looking at under 1% of current pipeline that is actually catering to permanent removals. So if you have a net zero commitment in 2025, you better start looking now and secure that supply for the next year to come. Then clearly there's also pricing risk as demand is growing, right? We've seen crazy price spikes. So there's definitely a value in sometimes thinking about pre-purchasing, doing certain long-term contracts with certain categories to kind of understand where you're at in terms of cost in 10 to 20 years. And ultimately, challenging for most larger buyers is also the policy risk. So as climate policy on a global level, but also on many local levels are evolving, some of the credits that you can currently buy might actually be part of NDCs, might require corresponding adjustments. So you're always in this kind of problem between I need to secure supply for 10 years, but at the same time I don't know whether this supply might actually still be valuable and viable when I actually get to it. And we have a pretty data-driven approach to this, and this is what I wanted to kind of share with you, like how we go about it. And we basically give 4 recommendations, and that's something that you can also do in our software, so that's fully productized. But to go through, the first one is you need to get validated data on your credits, and that goes way beyond the certification. It goes way beyond Verra, Gold Standard. That's a base layer. But what you really have to do is you need to get additional data points that are independent from the standards that make it comparable across standards. The second point is you need to be very specific in how you purchase certain kind of credits because the supply pricing constraints are very, very different depending on the category. The third being you need to mix. If you have 2 projects, the exposure that you will have, it's like having a stock portfolio with 2 stocks, basically. You shouldn't do that, right? So you need to actually start to compose a portfolio based on data that has the biggest impact that will maybe evolve over time as supply comes up. And the fourth part is that you need to, after purchase, really monitor as well. You need to keep an eye on this and keep track on this. And I'm just going to go in quickly. So the credit fundamentals that we, for example, work with is clearly starting with the very basics, like are you actually buying removal or avoidance? You would be surprised how many people do not know what they're buying, particularly in the nature-based solution space, where avoided deforestation or afforestation makes a difference, right? Often it's kind of clumped together. You need to understand what permanence is, because a lot of the standards that we're expecting will also deal with permanence. So if you look at the regulation of the European Union, if you look at even UNFCCC regulation, if you look at the net zero standard of ISO, they're always requiring permanent removals to actually account for against your footprint. So while the definition is still outstanding, you should at least know where your permanence stands right now. You need to look at additionality risk, huge topic still. It's very specific to the project type. We work with scientific data that we developed with a few universities to kind of look at what is it that we actually know based on peer-reviewed data, based on actual experiments in the field, and we cater that to every credit. And then we also look at co-benefits. What does it for society? Are they verified? and clearly the vintage year and the NDC status of the specific sector. So for each and every credit that you will put into your portfolio, you will kind of need to either research by hand or use a product like CEEZER to actually get comparable information. And you need to do it in a way that allows you to compare between both the different standards, but also more importantly, between the different technologies that can vary heavily in all of these metrics. And there is not one good one or one bad one, but ultimately you need to kind of make a judgment call of what you want to optimize for. And if we go into the second point, which is you need to be category specific, this is data on the current pipeline availability. So this is all the current pipeline projects from the biggest standards in the world and what they would at scale then annually produce in terms of carbon credits. And what you see here in a nutshell is that the market is currently growing exactly like it used to be for the past 10 years, which is that around 5 to 7% would probably qualify as removal, probably under 1% would qualify as permanent removal, and the rest continues to be avoidance. And what it means for you if you build a portfolio for the long term is that you need to probably start to look into removal credits and secure them rather early, because there's probably going to be a shortage, because the growth right now is way too slow compared to what will be needed to actually materialize net zero. And you might want to keep a bit of more flexibility in the avoidance space, because the pipelines are super strong, they still produce a lot, and there's still a lot of development activity in there, which will mean that the pricing risk is probably going to be a bit lower, and you will have a bit more flexibility to actually do this. And if you approach it that way, if you look at your corporate net zero journey, what you can then do is, and it's a very complicated graph, but what you can then do is basically start really mapping out category by category how you want to fill those volumes within your required portfolio. And to give one example, so if you look at the, let's say, long-term removals, right, they're probably going to be low right now. They're prohibitively expensive sometimes. I mean, we're talking several $100s to thousands of dollars per ton. You might want to add them already for strategic purchasing reasons, because you want to build relationships with the suppliers, and quite frankly, because they need it. Yeah, all these removal players require early investment and early offtake. And a way for you to support it, even though you're not able to invest, let's say, $1,000 per ton, is to at least do this for a small part of your portfolio, because it gives the important traction points and allows for those players to grow. And then if you go to the complete other side of the market, which would be avoidance credits from traditional certifiers, where usually supply even today is pretty much abundant, there's strong pipeline activity, we would actually recommend to keep this kind of free for a longer while. I mean, first of all, you got to reduce it down towards net zero anyways, but there's definitely a strategic advantage of keeping some flexibility to profit from price increases or decreases, to profit from technology changes. And that's, I think, the other important part, is that often the credits that might be assumed to be super good right now or this year, you know, they might be considered to be probably not that good in 5 years, 10 years as methodologies and data evolves. So you might want to have some flexibility on this. And if you go for these kind of portfolios that ultimately that you need to execute on, it's important to keep an eye on them. And that's also what we encourage our customers to do. We also enable them to do that clearly in our product, which is to keep your credit portfolio basically live and running. We have live data on every credit that's in there. We have live updates also on the quality metrics around it. It goes until you can send alerts if something happens. But it's really important to start managing this almost like an asset that you hold, rather than something that's a one-off marketing cost that you have, how maybe some people thought a few years ago, right? And you clearly need data to do it. It also helps to communicate. I think we see that a lot of our customers are moving away from, carbon neutral claims anyways, but it's really more about showing what is it that you're doing, what is the impact that you're having, and what are the technologies that you're investing in and that you are supporting. And that ultimately also helps both from the credibility side, but it also gives you a better standing in terms of even internally defining and defending why you would want to spend a bit more on certain project categories, because it gives you valid data points to also kind of make this a rational decision, rather than just asking for more money ultimately, right? And for our customer base, I'm super happy to say we've seen that almost all, I think actually all of our customers working with CEEZER today have actually increased the amount of permanent removal. Often they started at zero. The moment that they can actually start to see and they see the quality data of their portfolio, it's usually getting a bit less. And you can also do it faster. You can try it out at our booth. We did develop an algorithm. We basically use financial math, so it's modern portfolio theory. That financial math allows us to use over 3.5 million data points on the global credit market. And what we ultimately do is for any price point and any requirement set, might be locations, project types, timeframes, we can essentially optimize the credit portfolio based on current data on volume and price. So You don't have to follow. I mean, clearly, a lot of corporates want to do their bespoke portfolio, which is super fine. But a lot of customers start that way to actually understand what is the breadth and what would an optimal portfolio look like. Because ultimately, I think we owe it for our climate and kind of also our planet to really make sure that if we invest in this, let's try to make it the best possible investment and the best possible impact. And right now, it's really hard to do without the right tooling to do so. So we're at booth C58. You can actually try it out. So we brought a demo version. Feel free to come by and build your portfolio according to your standards. And yeah, thanks a lot for listening. Yeah.
Thank you, Magnus. Do we have any questions? I see we've got a lot of people here. A lot of interest in carbon credits. We've got 2 questions.
Yeah, so my question is, where do you get the data which is additional to what the registries and others have?
Sure. So there's basically 3 sources. So the first being we have a scientific advisory board, and we collaborate pretty deeply with research groups across the world that actually do research on the credit market. So if you look at Berkeley National Climate Lab, I think in Europe it would be ETH Zurich has a great group doing it. Also Oxbridge, I mean the Cambridge group has a great data set. So we often collaborate with them to actually take their primary research data and see if we can translate it into something that's, let's say, functional enough for corporate buyers to actually understand. The second part is that we sometimes then also work with project developers themselves to kind of ask for additional data points. We have an impact team, so Dr. Carla Voigt, our Chief Impact Officer, is actually right there. She works with her team to make sure that we can translate those additional data points, we can benchmark them, and then kind of give a nudge around like where they stand compared to their peers. And then ultimately, a lot of the certification data that's out there is actually not used. So sometimes we also just literally work with the data that certification brings you. But we use our data basically engine in a way to kind of make sure that we really get all the value out of it. We can again benchmark, compare, enrich with other sources. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Really interesting talk. A quick question about the carbon credit worthiness of energy distribution. How carbon credit worthy is it?
Sorry?
How carbon credit worthy is energy distribution?
Yeah, so we do have a category that's called energy distribution. I think it's a pretty, let's say, colorful bunch of different methodologies right now. So let's say I would assume like 90% of our credits are certified with the largest standard. So that would be Variable Standard, ACR, CAR, Plan Pivo, Puvo. They have varying methodologies. I mean, they exist. I think generally it's becoming, my point of view, I think we see that it's becoming challenging from a policy additionality point of view, because in many jurisdictions, policy already would kind of require upgrades of energy distribution, which would disqualify it for creating voluntary credits. That said, I think if you can get the policy point down, you're definitely able to do something. They range in the lower price category, just to add. So it's usually not a super high value credit in a sense, as they are normally avoidance and not removal. Yeah.
We've got time for one more question. Any more?
Hey there. With the introduction of the revised SBTI criteria and the target of a 95% absolute reduction, have you guys seen a drop off in the requirement for carbon removals? What's the sort of strategy that customers are looking at the moment?
Super good question. So if you didn't understand, so there's increasingly requirements to only reduce a very small amount of your remaining footprint. That's totally fine for us. I think that's actually the right thing to do. What we have seen is that there's a shift in purchasing strategy. So even the 5% of removal are often in dollar value, it's often way more than they're currently spending on avoidance credits. So there's definitely a lot of interest. What we see is they start to plan ahead. So often they start to purchase for 2030 and following already now. So today we can do that already. The other part is that we also see that there's a lot of voluntary commitment in a sense. So many companies say we will do this once we approach these years and we do SBTI, but on the way there, and I think it was kind of starting to be acknowledged by SBTI last year around COP when they also published the guidance to say you also need to, if you can, please do more. And I think a lot of the customers that we work with already do that as well. Yeah.
That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
We're going to have a 5-minute break, and following this will be re-energized.